Hi again everyone. This week we're going to have a look at adding part lines to geoforms to create product-like features, and then we're going to render different material finishes and textures. And although I'm just using basic geoforms in this demonstration, I'd like to see you apply these techniques to your complex geoform materials and textures renderings for Sketching Portfolio 2. So this is going to be for the last 3 pages of that folio, as we know is due in week 12 now. So in the previous exercise we looked at rendering matte surfaces just using grey marker only, and that was important to understand how to control the mediums and also to communicate shape and form with good contrast. We're going to take that same information but now render different finishes. And now if we have just a quick overview of what I'm going to cover, we can see that this box form here, I've added some part lines to create some interesting separations of surfaces, which may be an indication of different part assembly or different color, different texture, different material. On the top you've got a transparent series of little boxes that sit on top of that, and we're going to render that, of course, based on light source direction. With these two cones, we've modified the structure, paying attention to the ellipses and how the degree or the openness of that ellipse changes depending on the angle of view. With the cone tipped on its side, you can see how the major axes of these ellipses are 90 degrees to that center line. So we're still applying all our perspective construction fundamentals. Over here with the cylinder, just by adding some part lines, again paying attention to the degree of those ellipses and a half dome on the top, we're going to look at transparency of this dome at the base of this cone and of course the top of that box. We're going to look at highly reflective material finishes like chromium or aluminium. We're also going to be applying some texture to some of these surfaces, and Charlie showed you a demo of using found materials and textures to use as underlays to which you can rub over the top and bring up texture. In the examples that I've got here, I'm actually using a texture board. On the right hand side for the cylinder, I'm using a dimpled surface, and the flip side of this texture board are these parallel lines, to which I used as an underlay to bring up texture on this box. Before we start rendering, I just wanted to show you the original sketch and also talk about the materials that I'll be using. So this is a freehand sketch using a multi-liner fine liner, and you can also see that if you sketch lightly, you can leave all your construction on the page and just use heavier line weight to define the edges that you need. You'll also notice that my leading edges are actually left really light, just in case I want those to be a highlight. And in terms of materials, I'm going to be using a range of greys from a 1, 3, 5, 7, including black, 3 colors, and I'm actually using color matched colored pencils to my markers, as well as black and white pencils. For the highlight work, I'm going to be using a Uni Posca PC3M, as well as a Uniball Signo, and 2 different white pencils. One's a soft pencil, that's the Prismacolor Premier here, and the other one is a medium to hard chord pencil, and that's the Albrecht Dürer, and also some kind of textured surface. And just like any rendering, we have to think about our lighting scenario, so we need to think about the direction of light as well as the angle of light. And you can see with these 3 objects here, I'm using a light source from the right direction, and for the cylinder, I'm actually using the light source from the left. To save some time, I'm going to render the matte surfaces on these objects, namely the base of this rectilinear form, the front of the cone, and the textured surface of this cylinder. We've covered that considerably over the matte surface exercises previously. That way we can concentrate on rendering high reflectivity and transparency in texture. So here I'm back with the matte surface and textured surfaces rendered just in grey marker, and you can see I've rendered them based on the light source position and what we know about a 1, 2, 3 read, or our light, medium and dark surfaces. So the top surface of this box would be our number 1 read, but that's going to be the transparent feature. The right vertical surface is our number 2 reed, or our mid-tone, and the left vertical surface is going to be the number 3 reed, or the shadow tone. On the cone we can see the light source position based on our highlight. Of course we'll have the shadow core and reflected light shown as well. On the cylinder, change in direction of light source from the top left, so we can see our highlight position, our shadow core, our minor shadow core rolling to the left. The top surface of that cylinder, of course, would be flat, and that would be our number 1 reed, which is our lightest surface, and I've just slightly graded that towards the light source at the front. I'm also going to use just some plain paper as a mask, just so that I'm not dragging my hand across the sketches, particularly when I'm doing pencil work and painted highlights. I want to make sure that I'm not smudging anything as I'm working through these sketches. Okay, so starting off with these 4 little boxes that are transparent, what helps to communicate transparency is to be able to see some features inside. And you can see that I'm including some detail for the wall thickness of these transparent blocks. We can see a little bit of shadow, what we call occlusion shadow, and nice bright highlights on the part lines. So what we're trying to do is establish some tonal value at the back and then bring everything forward with our pencil detail. So I'm just going to start by using a number 3 grey and just indicating some wall thickness of those blocks. And then number 3 is quite light, and really what I'm trying to do is show that there's actually, each of these blocks has an edge, and because it's transparent you might actually just be able to see some of that thickness of those edges of those blocks. And chances are I might enhance this with a bit of pencil later on. For the colour, I'm using this BG23, and those of you that bought the base kit, you'll actually have this colour, and I'm basically just going to use it to establish some basic form. This is the number 2 side reed, so I'm just going to use 1 hit of this colour. This is the number 3 side reed, and I'm going to do the same. I can give it a second hit and that will make it a little darker, but what I can do is just run a 5 on top of that, just so that it looks like it's the transparent shadow side, but the colour's still going to show through. Our lightest surface is the top surface, and that's our number 1 reed. It's also the surface that we're going to show reflections on. So I'm going to plan my reflection position, and we want these just to be straight up and down. We want to be careful that it doesn't look like a zebra. Okay, so that's going to be my position for my highlight or my reflection. I'm just going to come in and fill those. Of course, we can clean these up with pencil later on. A lot of the times, reflections aren't just a flat block of colour, so I'm just going to add a little bit of contrast within these reflections. Here I'm just using a number 3 grey and just knocking back a little bit of that brightness in some areas of the reflection. And what that'll tell me is I can afford to go a little darker on the shadow side, even though it's transparent. And I think that's going to look quite good. And what tends to happen is once we put extra marker down, we can see that the initial occlusion shadows that we put have lost some intensity. So I can just come back with the same number 3 and just in some areas enhance what were going to be the thicknesses of the walls of each of these little blocks. So in terms of marker work for that transparent detail, that's pretty much it. I'm going to define all the line work on this top section and then I'll come back to you. So I decided to basically redo all my line work. Leading up to that last stage, everything was freehand sketched, freehand rendered. When you're defining your line work, you're welcome to use templates as I have, so I've just used the straight edge. Notice I haven't defined any of the leading edges because they're going to be highlights. The part lines where we're separating different materials, color or tonal value, they were fine to scribe in because those lines actually define a separation between parts. I will still have highlights on them, as you'll see, but I scribe those all in. So now I'm going to start my white pencil detail work. I'm going to start at the top of the rendering and work my way down. We know that white pencil doesn't work well on black pencil, so sometimes you'll do your black pencil work first, sometimes you'll do your white pencil work first. Here I'm just going to describe the leading edge highlight. So I've got a nice sharp white pencil and I'm just going to get over the top of the rendering and just define that leading edge. Now this pencil is really soft. It's called a Prismacolor Premier and they are really buttery. They're great for this sort of work. It's like with markers, you can choose different brands, different styles, depending on what you can control the best, what works for you. So with white pencils, it's always good to have various types of pencils, depending on the application. The Albrecht Dürer is a medium point or hardness, and that's a really good all-rounder. I find when it's necessary for me to do highlight work like this, sometimes a softer pencil works better for me. Okay, so that's the leading edge, and then I'll just freehand this in. Now, with this crisscross, those black lines are part lines. They're actually gaps. So I'm actually going to pick up the top of that black line, and that's the actual position of the edge of the block. So a lot of students, when they're starting off, they're not sure where and why we put the white pencil. Is it on the top of that black line or on the bottom of that black line? You're just going to remember that black line denotes a separation of parts. It actually doesn't exist. It's just a gap, and you're just scribing the highlight. Okay. Some of these sections I will just put it on fast forward and some music for your listening pleasure. Other times I'll just let it run, depending on if I think I've got anything intelligent to say along the way. Okay, so that's scribing the leading edges facing towards light source. Remember, our light source is coming from this direction. So we're picking up all the edges that would receive light from this direction. And that includes these little ones. I'll do it also on this little band denoted by the darker value. I'm drawing the highlight on the bottom of that black line, because remember that black line is just a gap. Yeah, you need a nice, clean, sharp white pencil to do this. Okay, highlight edge. This mid-tone grey. So it's mid-tone grey, right? But I am doing it on the shadow side. Picking up that highlight edge, or the edge pointing upwards. And I'll take my time explaining this because it's important to understand, and you've got an opportunity to watch this video over and over. So I'll say it again, that black line is a space, it's a part line. So below that black line is the top edge of this surface, so it picks up light. The top of that black line is the bottom edge of this surface. But just like anything to do with drawing and rendering, the more you do it, the more you practice, eventually the penny will drop and you'll be able to do it automatically. Okay, highlight edge. While I'm here, I'll just go and do this one. And as soft as this white pencil is, you notice I haven't actually sharpened it yet. So I tend to rotate the pencil to keep it sharp. And sometimes I go over and do the line again because I want it to stay the same thickness. I want it to be consistently that thick, that edge. Now this edge will receive light based on where the light is coming from. And that edge that I'm about to do is facing the light source direction. Even though it's in shadow, I'm going to give it a bit of definition. That's not to say that some edges that are pointing downwards do not receive a highlight. Again, you can use it a bit of license. At the end of the day, if it works, do it. But you've got to live with your mistakes. The good thing about pencil, of course, is you can rub it out. And the only other one really to do is this major leading edge. Okay, sorry guys, there was probably 3 minutes where I had my head down and I couldn't see the fact that I was out of shot. So basically I was detailing the edges of the highlight edges of the bottom surface here, and you can pretty much see that all these edges below the black line are the top edges of this sort of squashed H feature. So all those edges are pointing up, which would receive a highlight. This little area here, which would be the continuation or the same material as this section, I'm picking it up as a highlight, which tells us that it's all flush. If you ran your hand along this surface, it would be all flush. And same on the shadow side, because it's the same surface and detail, it's just in shadow. In shadow, we're using a little bit of license, even though you may not see this if it was a photographed product shot. We're using our license just to communicate that those details are there. Okay, so while we're here, I'm going to address the textured surface. I've got my texture board. I'm using the parallel lines. I'm going to consider the angle that I want those lines to appear as a texture. Sit that underneath my page, and I'm actually using the heavier medium hardness pencil, the Albrecht Dürer. This soft pencil will end up filling the gaps and flattening that out. I still want the tonal value to come through. I just want to bring up the texture using this pencil. Texture board in position and your pencil on the side, I'm just going to bring up the texture. And that's pretty much it. On the shadow side, I'm going to adjust the angle of the textures or these lines because I don't want them to be running linear with the ones that I've just put down. So I'm going to have it in this position and just do the same. So the last thing that goes down on a rendering really should be your painted highlights. We just want to make sure that all the detail work is done, all the line work definition is nice and crisp before we put in any of those painted highlights. I'm going to use some black pencil here and start to add a bit of detail to, let's say, these wall thicknesses. And here I'm just adding dark. Of course, when you get a dark line next to light line, you get full contrast. And I'm just trying to indicate the thickness of, let's say, some of these walls. You know, we started off with those exclusion shadows. And I'm just doing a couple of flicks in key areas just to help communicate some depth and internal features. Where you get these vertical white reflections, I'm not going to put any black line because that's actually a reflection, yeah? So even when I do something like this, I'm going to be wary of where my green stops, and I'll just fade out that black line. Okay, so here I'm really just trying to indicate that these blocks, we can sort of see some edges on the inside through this material. And it's this kind of detail that helps to communicate that depth and transparency. Sometimes you can overwork it, yes, and it does take some practice. I've got many of these wrong, but at the end of the day, it's this sort of layering of texture underneath. When we put the painted highlights down, it really starts to pop, and surprisingly and thankfully it does show that transparency. Okay, and when you look at glass, let's say the rim of a glass, and depending how you position it towards light, you'll actually see these sort of things. Okay, again through here, I'm not going to put too much dark pencil work there because that's a highlight where it's white. Okay, so that's going to set up my painted highlights really nicely. And the painted highlights will be the brightest contrast on this area, and all this work just allows it to give some depth. Okay, so we're going to do our painted highlights now. I'm going to be using a white pencil, that's the soft Prismacolor pencil. For these highlights, I think I'm going to use this Uniball Signo broad pen. Now these are quite good, though they are a metal ball white paint pen. Sometimes that ball gets stuck, so I haven't fully endorsed these things just yet, but they do have a nice fine point. If I'm doing a slightly larger rendering, then I would definitely use the PC3M. That's the classic standard amongst industrial designers. Back in the day, we used to use white gouache and a really fine 000 paintbrush. These pens have made putting highlights a lot more convenient. What I will do though is I quite like doing some lens flaring. And again, I'm showing you, let's say, a method that's quite finished, and then you can sort of take shortcuts when you're doing ideation type rendering. But just on these sections of the highlight edge, I'm just going to flare it a little bit with this white pencil, because that's what tends to happen when you get a highlight. You don't just get a stark line, you get this flaring, and you'll lose part of that highlight and also the part line, but it does give it quite a nice dimension. So I'm just going to do, these are actually the positions of where my painted highlight's going to be, and you can see how we're starting to lose the definition of that part line, and that's my intention anyway. So I'll have one highlight and it'll stagger. Right, so now that we have my flares, I'm going to position my highlight pen and just create an intensity of where that light might be. And now we're just going to finish off some of these other highlights. So these corners of these boxes might receive intense light. So I'm just going to put a little highlight on each of those. Here as well. And where two edges join and might have a little tiny radius there, I might put a highlight there. And highlight here. So you can see when you add those painted highlights, it really starts to pop. And I guess just to be consistent with the demo rendering, the one that I showed you earlier, I might just flare here and here. So it's just a soft landing spot for the painted highlight. And just right on that highlight edge. So the last thing I would do is maybe just have a look at some other areas and edges that might need to be lifted, possibly with a little bit of reflected light. Sometimes your white pencil work may have lost a little bit of contrast as you were continuing to do different parts of the rendering. So you might want to come back and just enhance some areas just to lift some of the details. A lot of the times these reflected surfaces will have a highlight just in the middle of nowhere. We've got to be careful with that. I think this is all the extra noodling that you really don't have to do, and it's highly not necessary because the transparency, which is what we're trying to communicate in this rendering, is already communicated successfully. Okay, so that's pretty much it for that box. Let's move on to the next one.